Imagine being trapped in a never-ending nightmare where the truth is more terrifying than you ever could have imagined. A case that pulls you deeper and deeper until you become part of the story itself. Stay tuned as we unravel the chilling mystery that even the most seasoned detectives couldn't escape. Trust me, you won't believe the shocking twist at the end. This is a story you have to see to believe. The storm outside raged. Rain lashed against the windows, relentless. A sharp crack of thunder echoed, shaking the walls. Inside, the room was dim, lit only by a flickering lamp. Detective Connor sat at the table. His fingers drummed on the cold wood. He had seen it all. The blood. The bodies. But tonight? Tonight, something felt different. The case file lay open before him. Pictures scattered across the table. The victim. A young woman, her life taken too soon. The scene was brutal. But something wasn't right. The photos were clear. But Connor couldn't shake the unease crawling up his spine. Each detail was too perfect. Too staged. His breath hitched as he leaned in closer. A faint scent filled the air. Something metallic. Blood? No. It was something else. He glanced around the room. Empty. Quiet. But his senses were on high alert. A sudden knock on the door broke his focus. He jumped, heart pounding. His instincts screamed, but he stood. Grabbing his gun, he walked toward the door. Another knock. Louder this time. Slowly, he turned the handle. The door creaked open. And there she stood. The woman from the case. Her eyes wide, unblinking. Her skin pale, almost translucent. A shadow of life clung to her. But something was wrong. Her mouth twitched into a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Connor's hand faltered, the gun slipping slightly. He stared. Was this real? The woman stepped inside, the door closing behind her. There was no sound, just the heavy silence that filled the room. She didn't speak. Her gaze locked onto his. And then a whisper. Barely audible. Help me. Connor's heart skipped a beat. The air around them grew colder. Frost seemed to form on the edges of the room. He could feel it, the chill creeping up his arms. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The woman's smile stretched wider. A grin of malice. Her eyes flickered, no longer human. Connor stumbled back, his breath quickening. Something wasn't right. Something was horribly, horribly wrong. The truth was here. But it wasn't what he expected. Not at all. Connor's hand shook as he reached for his phone, but it slipped from his grasp. The woman's figure seemed to shimmer, fading in and out of focus. The room grew colder still. A deep chill that settled in his bones. He took a step back, trying to steady his breath. His mind raced. Was she real? A figment of his exhausted mind? But her presence felt undeniable. Her form was solid, unyielding. Who are you? Connor managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper. The woman's smile widened. I'm what you've been chasing. Her voice was like ice scraping against glass. The words sent a jolt through Connor. He could barely think, couldn't process what was happening. But he was sure of one thing. This was no ordinary case. She tilted her head, the motion unsettling. I've been waiting for you. The air thickened. Connor could feel the pressure building, as though the very walls were closing in on him. He couldn't breathe. His chest tightened, his heart pounding like a drum. With a sudden movement, she stepped forward, her eyes locking onto his. And then she reached out. Connor froze, his entire body stiff with terror. Her fingers brushed against his cheek. Cold. So cold. The touch sent a shockwave through his entire being. A sensation like ice creeping under his skin. His vision blurred, everything spinning. He staggered, unable to hold himself upright. The world around him seemed to fracture. In a flash, the room was gone. The walls dissolved, the flickering light vanishing. And Connor was no longer in the familiar office. He was standing in the dark. A dense, suffocating fog surrounded him. He could barely see, but the sense of danger was palpable. Every breath felt shallow, his pulse erratic. The woman's voice echoed around him, distorting in the fog. "Welcome to my world, detective." And then, silence. Complete silence. No sound. No movement. Just the eerie, quiet pressing in from all sides. Connor's heart raced. Was this a dream? A nightmare? He tried to move, but his legs wouldn't obey. His body was paralyzed, as if trapped in some unseen force. The mist parted just slightly, revealing a figure in the distance. A man, his face obscured. Connor's gut twisted. Was this the man from the case? The fog thickened again, the man vanishing into it. And then a voice. Not the woman's. A man's. "Are you ready to understand?" Connor's breath caught in his throat. The voice, low and rasping, hung in the air. It was too familiar. He strained to see through the mist. His heart pounded so loudly, it felt like the fog was vibrating with each beat. He tried to speak, but his voice was swallowed up by the eerie quiet. The figure emerged again. Slowly. Shrouded in shadows, he seemed to float, his feet not touching the ground. A distorted figure, his form wavering like smoke. "Who are you?" Connor managed, his voice a rasp of desperation. The man smiled, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. It was cruel, twisted. A smile that made the air feel thick with dread. "I am the answer you seek." The words were cold, final. Connor's legs wobbled, but he fought to remain standing. He tried to focus on the man, but everything around him seemed to melt, to distort. The fog swirled around him like a vortex. Suddenly, he was no longer in the fog. He was back in the office. But it wasn't the same. The walls were splattered with blood, dark crimson stains soaking into the wallpaper. The photos on the table were no longer of the woman. They were of him, Connor, his own face twisted in horror. His own body lying lifeless, broken. The air was thick with the scent of decay. The floor beneath his feet was slick, sticky, with something he couldn't bear to name. The temperature had dropped so low, he could see his breath, misting in front of him. And then, the woman appeared again. But now, her face was twisted, grotesque. Her eyes were empty, hollowed out. "Do you see it now, detective?" she whispered, her voice a guttural rasp. "You're part of the story." Connor's stomach churned. This wasn't just a case. It was a trap. He wanted to scream, but the air felt thick, suffocating. The words died in his throat. The room started to spin. The walls seemed to pulse, breathing with a life of their own. Connor stumbled, falling to his knees. And then, the man's voice again. "You're here, detective, because you wanted to know. But sometimes the truth is worse than the crime." Connor's pulse raced. The room around him seemed to collapse in on itself, warping into something unrecognizable. And then it happened. The final realization. The truth. The case was never about solving a murder. It was about becoming part of the story itself. The air grew thick, pressing in from all sides. Connor's vision blurred again, the edges of reality bending and twisting. His mind screamed, trying to make sense of the nightmare. But there was no escape. The walls were closing in, suffocating him. The blood on the floor seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as though the room itself was breathing. Each breath was harder than the last. The man's form flickered at the edge of his sight, a shadow in the chaos. "You were never meant to leave," he said, his voice a low growl. Connor's heart raced. He tried to stand, to run, but his body wouldn't obey. His legs felt like lead, his chest tight with the weight of terror. The woman stepped closer. Her smile had twisted into something monstrous. Her once beautiful face now looked like a mask of agony. "Don't you understand?" she hissed. "This is the end of the line for you. You're part of the story now." Connor's mind spun with confusion. What did she mean? How was this possible? He looked around, desperate for any sign of the familiar world. But it was all gone. The office was gone. The storm outside, the lamp, the case file. All of it dissolved into nothingness. The man's voice echoed in his mind. The detective always becomes part of the story. It's the price of knowing too much. Connor's breath came in ragged gasps. The woman's eyes glowed with an eerie, unnatural light. Her hand reached out, fingers curling toward him. He tried to fight it, to break free, but the darkness consumed him. The last thing he saw was her hand, cold and unyielding, wrapping around his throat. The world around him went black. In that instant, the truth hit him harder than anything he had ever felt before. The cases he had solved, the crimes he had unraveled, they weren't just stories. They were traps. And now he was part of one. The darkness swallowed him whole. And everything went silent. The truth was no longer a mystery. It was a nightmare. Time seemed to stretch, distort, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. Connor's mind swirled in the void. He couldn't feel his body, couldn't hear anything, just the crushing silence. And then the sound, faint at first, a low hum, a vibration that pulsed beneath him like a heartbeat in the dark. Suddenly, a flash of light, a sharp, blinding brightness cut through the endless black. He gasped, but there was no air. He tried to move, but his limbs wouldn't respond. The light intensified, dimming and brightening in rapid cycles. And then he saw it, a figure. At first, just a silhouette, a shape in the light, barely defined. But as the glow settled, the figure became clearer. A person, but not the woman, not the man, someone else. The figure stepped closer, the figure with cold, glassy eyes. It was another detective. The realization hit Connor like a physical blow. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't a hallucination. It was a cycle. The same trap. The same fate. The detective before him didn't speak. Just stared. His face blank, expressionless. And then a whisper. "I was you." The words sent a shiver through Connor's already numb body. The detective's lips moved again. "Now you're part of the story. Just like I was." Connor's pulse thundered in his ears. He was no longer in control. No longer in the world he knew. The light flickered. The detective faded away. And Connor was alone again. But not really. The room around him shifted once more. And there she was. The woman from before. Only this time, her smile was gone. Her eyes were empty pits. Her mouth opened, but the sound that came out was not human. A long, terrible scream. It echoed, vibrated, rattled the bones. Connor's vision spun again. He wanted to scream, to escape. But his voice was gone. All he could do was watch. Watch as the woman's face contorted into something grotesque. Her form shifting, distorting, until it was a blur of twisted shapes. "Welcome to your fate," she whispered, her voice now deep and hollow. The world around him shattered. And Connor knew then. There was no getting out. Not for him. Not for anyone. The truth had claimed him. The sensation of falling gripped him. Falling, but with no end in sight. No ground beneath his feet. No ceiling above. Just endless darkness, stretching on forever. But then, a faint, unnatural light. It wasn't warm. It wasn't comforting. It was cold, almost as if it were pulling him down deeper. His body, his senses began to snap back. The weight of the darkness lifted, if only slightly. And then, he was back. Back in a room. The room that had never left. The table was there. The photos were scattered across it. The victim's face stared up at him, lifeless. But this time, the faces weren't familiar. Not the faces of the victims he'd seen before. It was his face. Every photo was his own. Every single one. The walls around him pulsed with a sickening, rhythmic throb. The smell of decay was thick, cloying. It was impossible to breathe without gagging. He reached for the case file, but it wasn't there. The photos weren't his doing. They weren't part of the case he had been investigating. His eyes locked on the door that had been closed before, but now it was open. A figure stood in the doorway, tall, shadowed, and faceless. The figure stepped forward, and Connor stumbled back, heart racing. A familiar voice echoed in the room.
Soft. Low.
"I've been waiting for you, detective." It was the voice from before. The voice of the man who had trapped him here. He wanted to run, wanted to scream, but his body refused to move. The shadow stepped closer, closer, until it was standing right in front of him. Connor's heart beat so fast it hurt. His breath was ragged, shallow. "Are you ready to finish what you started?" the figure asked. Connor's mind spun, his thoughts racing. "Finish what?" The figure smiled, and Connor knew then. This wasn't just about solving the case. This wasn't just about the crime. This was about becoming part of it. "Now," the figure whispered. "Now it's your turn." The room around him went black. The darkness swallowed him whole. No light, no sound, just an oppressive, suffocating void. And then a pulse, a flicker of light, but not enough to see. It was as though something was watching him from the shadows. Connor's heart raced. He wanted to scream, but no words came. His limbs felt frozen, unable to move. And then, a faint whisper. So quiet. It felt like it was inside his mind. "You're part of the story now." The words weren't just spoken. They were felt. He could feel them wrapping around him, tightening. There was no escape. No way out. The whispering grew louder. More voices joined in. A chorus of voices, distorted, agonized. They were all around him, calling out. Some begging for release. Others laughing. The light flickered again, this time brighter. But it wasn't just any light. It was the glow of countless eyes. The room, no, the place shifted. It was no longer the office. It was something else. Something vast and endless. Connor's body was trembling, but it was as though he couldn't even feel it. A figure emerged from the light. The man. The one who had led him here. But he wasn't alone. There were others. All of them, standing in a circle around him. Each face distorted, shattered. Connor's breath hitched in his throat. He tried to turn, to flee, but the ground beneath him was like quicksand.
He was trapped.
The figure in the center stepped forward, smiling that cruel, empty smile. "You thought you were solving a case," the figure said, its voice mocking. "You thought you were chasing the truth. But the truth, detective, is far worse than you ever imagined." The ground beneath Connor cracked open. Darkness poured through the fissures, crawling up his legs. The voices grew louder, filling his ears, overwhelming him. It was no longer just the voices of the dead. It was the voices of the detectives. Every one of them. All the ones who had been here before. The ones who had failed to escape. And now Connor understood. There was no case to solve. No mystery to unravel. The truth was this place. This nightmare. Where detectives came. And never left. He felt the cold hand on his shoulder, a touch that burned like ice. He turned to face the figure. But it wasn't the man anymore. It was him. His own face. Twisted and broken. "Welcome home," the figure whispered. Connor gasped, his lungs struggling to pull in air that felt like it was made of ice. His own face, distorted, twisted, stared back at him with eyes that weren't his own. He stepped back, but the darkness pressed in, surrounding him. The others, the detectives, the lost souls, watched, their faces filled with hollow recognition. Some stared at him with pity, others with empty, knowing eyes. Connor couldn't speak. The words lodged in his throat like stones. The twisted version of himself smiled, a grim expression that sent chills down his spine. "You're one of us now," it said, the voice a mockery of his own. He tried to move, tried to run, but the ground was a sinking tar, pulling him deeper. Every step felt heavier than the last.
Why?
Connor managed, his voice cracking. Why me? The figure, the reflection of his own twisted self, leaned in closer. Because you wanted the truth, it whispered. But truth, detective, truth isn't something you can simply solve. It's something you become. The air seemed to shift. The cold grew unbearable, seeping deep into his bones. The voices around him, whispers, cries, laughter, echoed in the distance. The words blurred together, a cacophony of souls trapped in this nightmare. Connor's hands trembled. He reached out, grasping at the shadows, but they slipped through his fingers. The figure laughed softly. There's no escaping, it said. You are part of the story now. The story has claimed you. You're one of the detectives who never left. Connor's body was heavy, numb. His thoughts were foggy, clouded by the truth he had chased for so long. The darkness swallowed him deeper, pulling him into a place where time no longer mattered. A place where all the detectives before him had been consumed, where they had become part of the endless cycle. A place where there was no end. The weight of it pressed down, crushing him. And the last thing he heard, before everything went dark, was a final whisper. Now you're one of the stories we tell. And the darkness closed in, sealing his fate. There was no more sound, no more whispers, no more darkness. Only an infinite silence. Connor's thoughts, if they could even be called thoughts anymore, swirled in the void. Time no longer existed here. He no longer knew what was real, what was imagined. He was just drifting. The oppressive weight of this place, this nightmare, settled around him like a second skin. But then, in the distance, a flicker. A weak, almost imperceptible light. It was the faintest glow, but it cut through the nothingness like a blade. Connor tried to move toward it. His body, his mind, responded with nothing but a hollow ache. The light grew stronger, drawing him in, pulling him closer. And then, as he approached, he saw it.
A door.
A door standing alone in the middle of the darkness, bathed in the eerie, pale light. His heart pounded. Could this be a way out? But as he reached for the door, a voice stopped him. Not the twisted version of himself. Not the others. But a different voice. A voice soft.
Come.
Are you sure you want to leave? It was the voice of the woman. The victim. She stood behind the door, her face no longer twisted in agony. Her eyes, though still hollow, held something else now. Something Connor couldn't place. I've seen this before, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. And it's always the same. Connor's hand hovered over the door's handle. Once you open it, there's no going back, she continued. You'll be free. But only for a while. He looked at her, the reality of the situation sinking in. Why me? He asked, his voice hoarse. Why am I here? The woman's lips curled into a faint, sorrowful smile. You wanted the truth, she replied softly. And now you've found it. Connor's chest tightened. The truth. The truth had never been what he thought it was. It was not just a case. Not just a series of crimes. It was a cycle. A never-ending loop. A trap. Once you leave, she said, you'll be part of it forever. He turned back to the door. The soft, beckoning light calling him. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him. But the woman's words lingered, haunting him. Do you really want to leave, detective? She asked again. For the first time since he'd arrived, Connor hesitated. The door seemed to loom larger as Connor stood before it, its handle cold to the touch. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in the stillness. He glanced over his shoulder, the woman's hollow eyes following his every movement. Once you leave, you'll never truly be free, she warned again. The air felt thick, as though the very atmosphere was pressing down on him. Was she right? Would leaving truly mean becoming part of something far darker? He clenched his fists, fighting the rising panic. The light beyond the door called to him, promising an escape. But the truth was something different. The woman's voice was soft, almost kind, but there was something in it that made his skin crawl. "You think you've solved a case, detective?" Her tone shifted. "You think you're escaping. But you're not. You never will be." Connor's fingers brushed the door handle.
His thoughts raced.
The life he had once known seemed so distant now. The case, the investigation, the people he had tried to save. Was it all for nothing? He could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him, suffocating him. If he opened the door, would he truly escape? Or was he just walking into another trap? His mind was spinning. The woman's words echoed in his ears, growing louder, more insistent. "You wanted the truth." Connor's breath hitched. The truth was the trap. He turned his gaze back to the door, his hand still hovering above the handle. The light behind it beckoned, but the darkness clung to him, anchoring him in place. He stepped back, and then he heard it. A low, guttural laugh that seemed to come from every corner of the darkness. The woman's form shifted, and suddenly, the others were there too. The twisted, hollow faces of the lost detectives. "You can't leave," one of them whispered, his voice distorted, filled with something ancient. "You were never meant to leave." And then, the door behind him slammed shut, as if it had never existed. The room, if it could still be called a room, twisted, spiraling around him. The faces of the lost detectives faded into the void, their laughter still lingering in the air. Connor's heart raced. The light, the hope of escape, was gone. And now he understood. There was no escaping this. There was no way out. The door was never meant to open. And now, like all the others before him, he was part of the story. The silence returned, thick and oppressive, like a weight pressing down on Connor's chest. He stood in the center of the endless void, surrounded by the faces of those who had come before him. The detectives, the victims, the ones who had tried to escape. All of them now a part of the story. Connor's mind was numb. His body felt like it didn't belong to him anymore, as if he were drifting in a world that was slowly losing all meaning. The faces around him faded in and out, flickering like old film footage, the distorted features of the lost souls never truly coming into focus. He could feel them, watching him. One by one, they disappeared into the dark, swallowed up by the emptiness that seemed to stretch forever. And yet, the feeling of being trapped remained, as if he were standing on the edge of a precipice, unable to move forward or back. There was no escape, not from this place, not from the cycle. The woman's voice, soft but insistent, broke the silence again. "Do you understand now, detectives?" Her words hung in the air, cold and final. Connor's breath came in shallow gasps. The truth. The one thing he had spent his life searching for. It had always been here, in this never-ending nightmare. "You wanted to know," she continued. "And now you know. But there's no going back. There never was." His thoughts felt like they were slipping through his fingers, each piece of his reality breaking apart. The darkness pressed in closer. It was all-consuming. And then, for the briefest of moments, Connor felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't freedom. It wasn't escape. But it was the acceptance of what he had become. The endless cycle had claimed him, just like the others. Just like he had feared.
He was part of it now.
The story. The case. And the case would never be solved. The last thing Connor heard, before the darkness closed in completely, was the soft whisper of the woman's voice. "It's your turn to tell the story now." And then nothing. The story had claimed him, and there was no escaping it. The world was no longer his own. It was as though the very concept of reality had shattered, leaving him adrift in a space that didn't belong to time or reason. Connor's mind, once sharp and focused, felt heavy now, muffled as if buried beneath layers of thick fog. He no longer remembered how long he had been standing in the void. The oppressive silence had stretched on for what felt like an eternity. But something was changing. The air around him grew heavier, thicker, as though the very space was bending under its own weight. A sound, a soft, haunting melody began to play, distant but unmistakable. It was the same eerie tune that had followed him throughout his investigation. The tune that had first led him into the dark. And then a figure appeared. At first, just a shadow in the distance, a faint outline that flickered in and out of existence. But as it drew closer, Connor could see it clearly. It was him. Not the distorted, twisted version he had seen before, but himself. His own face, unchanged, still full of the same determination he had once carried. Connor's heart raced, the familiarity of it all making the air feel even thicker. "Do you remember now?" the figure asked, his voice echoing through the stillness. Connor's chest tightened. He wanted to answer, but no words came. The figure smiled, but there was nothing warm about it. It was cold, empty. "You've been a part of this story for longer than you realize," the figure continued. "You've always been part of it.
You just didn't know it yet."
The truth hit Connor like a physical blow. He had never truly been free. The case, the investigation, it had all been leading him here. This was never about solving anything. It was about being consumed by it. "You were meant to solve it," the figure said. "But solving it only leads to one thing." The figure stepped forward, and Connor felt the coldness of the void close in around him. The trap. It had always been the trap. "You're not a detective anymore," the figure whispered. "You're part of the story." Connor's breath hitched. The world around him crumbled. And then there was only darkness. The darkness was all-encompassing now. Nothingness wrapped around Connor, pressing in like a suffocating force. Time had no meaning here, and reality seemed to bend and twist into shapes that didn't belong. But then, a light, a soft, warm glow flickered in the distance, and Connor instinctively moved toward it, his legs heavy, each step slow and labored. He reached out almost desperately. The closer he got, the brighter the light became. It was soothing, calming, like a gentle pull from a place he had long forgotten. And then in an instant he was there, standing in a familiar place. The office. The case files were neatly stacked on the table. The photos of the victims, of the crimes, still scattered across the surface. The air smelled of stale paper and dust, just as it had when he had first walked in. He blinked. It felt real. But it wasn't real, was it? His heart raced in his chest, and a cold feeling crept up his spine. The room looked unchanged, but something was off. The quiet hum of the office felt unnatural now. Connor's gaze shifted to the door. It was ajar just slightly. A figure stood in the threshold, watching him. It was the same twisted reflection from before, his own face, distorted, smiling that empty smile. "You're back," the figure said, its voice a distorted echo of his own. Connor tried to speak, but no words came. The figure stepped forward, its form growing clearer. And then the realization hit him. There was no escape. There never had been. This was the end of the story, the final chapter. He wasn't returning to the world he had known. This was his new reality. The figure reached out, placing a cold hand on his shoulder. "Now you understand," it whispered. Connor closed his eyes, the weight of it all settling in. The case, the investigation, it had never been about the truth. It had been about him becoming part of something far greater. And as the darkness closed in once more, there was no fear, only acceptance. The story had claimed him, and now he was part of it forever.